Perhaps that's why so many of the things I say are so strange. I repeat. All right, let's talk about the major themes of the Magic Mountain today, while also attempting to get through chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. And 5, if we have time, we will not have time. Even though we will talk so much about the subjective and objective elements of time today, I can be almost objectively sure, based on the heuristic of knowing how long it takes me to lecture on everything, that we will not get to chapter 5, though there is a very prescient discussion right at the beginning of chapter 5 on the experience of time for someone reading a novel. The claim, just because I know I'm not going to get to this, is that your experience of time while reading a novel mimics the experience of time passing for the protagonist, called hero by the narrator. I really want you to think about that. When you are experiencing art, particularly literary art, does time pass for you in the same way that it passes through the mind and eyes and being of the characters that you are embodying in articulate speech, or that you are reading about? Does one lose one's true perception of time and get pulled into sort of a narrative time? And I'll just suggest some potential piece of evidence for this. How many of you have ever been watching something, some sort of narrative, or reading something, and been touched on the shoulder just to, you've lost track of your surroundings, you've lost track of space, you've lost track of everything but that which you are focusing on. So you'll believe it when you see it. Perhaps you only see, well, what you focus on. And what is it that you focus on? Can you focus on that which you don't know exists? Interesting question. In any case, let's talk about the major themes today. Time and its subjective/objective nature. Death, we will talk about almost first today. Mental, physical, moral lassitude, turpitude that is experienced and that Seth Brady puts his finger on when talking to Hans Castorp, particularly when he gives a very analogous example to Hans Castorp about a young woman who came to the Berghof and adapted splendidly to it. And even when she healed, she refused to leave. The Berghof had become her home. Why does Seth Brady tell such a story to our young Hans Castorp, whom he recommends to leave after his second day, his first full day in Switzerland? What is it that he sees, that Seth Brady sees about this character? Oh, one note too that I should include. It's funny being sort of at the professor level, but instructor level, really, I forget what I've learned. Something you should know about German. And Herr is not a proper name. Herr is an honorific. Herr means Monsieur, Mr. Frau in German, these are German honorifics, means Mrs. Either an older woman or a married woman. And Fräulein with the umlaut, note that it's Fräulein, not Fraulein, means a young lady, like mademoiselle in French. A young lady or an unmarried lady, there's a tension between those two things that it can indicate. Which, if you see somebody who's like 28 years old, it puts you in a tense spot. Frau, Fräulein, you want to be respectful if you're a Southerner, and so you err on the side of miss, ma'am, whatever, and yet that still offends certain people, because then they think what? That you think that they're old, which is objective evidence that they look old, which is the worst thing you can do to somebody, right? Very unsocial, and yet you were just trying to be polite. So, names and honorifics, they matter. They very much matter. In any case, let's talk about these today. Something I told you I was going to get to, but I'm only going to spend a moment on today, is talk about the two major English translations of this text. And I tell you to beware. If you downloaded this text, there are many versions of it that have John E. Wood's translation on the title page, but are in fact the Low Porter translation. So if you very intelligently check your quotes against my quotes, and they are not rendered in the same way and on the same page, you do not have the right translation. Beware when you are writing your final essay of quoting from the wrong text. That is a major issue. So make sure that you are quoting, make sure that you are representing what you are reading from correctly to me. I take this very seriously. This institution takes this very seriously. That is on your credibility as a writer, that you represent what you see accurately. And so I admonish you, beware, beware, beware. In any case, the Low Quarter translation, very famous, 1927, 900 pages. The much newer 1995 John Woods translation, which I assigned to you, 706 pages, 194 pages fewer. And not because the font is substantial, because the translator has taken a different ethos, has taken a different philosophy of translation. Rather than rendering like Low Quarter the sentences as Germanically as possible. And something about German style is that it's based on Roman style, where one attempts to convey as intelligent a thought as possible through each sentence. It's only slightly hyperbole. And so sentences can get to 4, 5 lines long. It takes a lot of mental effort to keep these thoughts in one's head, and also, of course, to construct such thoughts and to conjugate a verb at the end, and to have had such, and to have structured such a thought before speaking, something as American English speakers is very much alien to us, because we just speak what comes into mind, and often just correct ourselves in the middle of a sentence. So the original translation tries very much to give you the sense of reading the original German. And many people love this translation as well. That said, I prefer the John E. Woods translation because I think it conveys better the experience of being at the Berghof at the expense of giving the original experience of reading in the German. I think it draws us in better. It's a little less long, in being less long-winded and getting a little bit more to the point, though also 700 pages is not a short book. That it may have a greater power to immerse you in its text than even the text that attempts to do so through long and winding passages. In any case, note that these translations are very, very different from each other. And if you would like to, if you find that you really love this text, I highly recommend that you read the one that you didn't read for this class at some bit, to see whether it changes your experience of the mountain. Maybe even the case that you love one translation and hate another. And what does that mean for whether you love the Magic Mountain or not? Do you love it at all? And this is something you should think about always with translated literature, that there is an element of faith in your reading. You're relying on somebody else's rendering of language from one language to another, and their choices. Remember the choice of Hans Castorp, a mediocre young man or an ordinary young man. That's one word that changes how we perceive an individual. And as a translator, you're responsible for translating all the words. Yes?
Haven't we made that assumption with every book we read in this class?
Except for the ones that were in English, like Ulysses. Yes. So no. But yes, whenever there is, this is why people like me exist. Not to tell you what the book says, but to tell you that you are not even seeing what the book says in this text, and to exhort you to learn. Insofar as you want to see the truth of it, learn it for yourself. That's the only way that you can have a less mediated vision. And even then, you will learn that there are layers and layers to what is mediated, and that even additions on which translations are based are themselves created through decisions. And there ought to be a great version of that. Look into the 1000 Nights and One Night edition, the Baghdad tradition. And then most of the stories that Americans think are from the Arabian Nights were themselves creations in the 19th century that were never in either of the editions, like Aladdin, for example. Aladdin, the one that Disney covers, was created by a guy named I think Hana Adi. He was a Syrian monk in the 19th century. In any case, good question. But let's get on to the chapters themselves. Chapter 1, meet Hans Castorp. Hans Castorp, very differently from our Stephen Devlis, on his way to meet his cousin Joachim, who himself wishes to be a military man, prior to taking his post as an engineer. Note these two professions. I mentioned the geopolitical situation. We know that World War I is going to break out at the end of this text in Weimar Republic, 1933 to 1945, where Germany fights. This will be two different times. There will be two achieves great power status and attempts to attempts military conquest. So look at these two jobs. Ocean steamships is being read by Hans Castorp. He's an engineer. He is helping to build up the navy of this country. And what does Joachim want to be? A military man. This is a nation that is preparing for what? Clearly preparing for what? War. Exactly. And so when we experience this sort of lustful moral lassitude of just indulging ourselves in Maria Mancini cigarettes and good heavy beer, 5 meals a day in the Swiss Alps, remember that the country of origin of Joachim and Hans is very much preparing for conflict, and that in fact one, and not the one that we would have expected, of these characters will end up being involved in this conflict. So for all the sweet, dulcet comfort that we will experience in the tuberculosis sanatorium, know that it is a very much a turbulent time, and in fact, a time that people did not know was as turbulent as it was because of the economic interconnections of the European nations. There will never be war again between them. That is something that people say now about nations. This is something that once you know it, should cast doubt on when you hear people say such things. Now, in any case, though, it is an electric time. Joachim has tuberculosis, but fervently wishes to rejoin his regiment. There is a certain natural integrity, perhaps even not natural, but second natural integrity to Joachim. Everybody respects him, and even the girl that he likes. So he's parallel to Hans Castorp and Metempsychosis, with a good Russian lady named Marussia. But he keeps a stiff upper lip and he refuses to indulge in lustful thoughts after her. He maintains his military discipline. Herr Settembrini, whose first name is Lodovico, he respects Joachim, and so does Director Behrens. Everybody seems to respect Joachim, who's himself afflicted with sickness, a sickness that, at least according to Hans Castorp's dream that we will get to at the end of this slide, may take him down a bobsled unto death, because remember that the bodies, they're sent down the mountain on bobsled, different from his normal bourgeois existence. That even though he is the one that is truly physically sick, morbidly physically sick, that there's something about his character that makes him respected by characters in a way that are his comrades, in a way that Hans Castorp is not. Whether Hans Castorp is ever truly respected by his lover, Shosha, who he has one Valpurgis not with, note that that is the same name as a chapter in God's Faust. It is very much like a Mardi Gras sort of experience. Whether he is truly respected by Dr. Krukowski, who himself gives him a yellow-teethed smile, shakes his hand when he's taken on as a patient at the end of chapter 4, and whether he's ever respected by Behrens, who will give him quite the tongue lashing, not once, but at least twice during the course of this text. Once when Hans Castorp assumes that he is being sent away glibly by Behrens because Joachim has just refused to stay. We'll get to that. And another time when Behrens really cuts Hans to the quick, Director Behrens cuts Hans to the quick by suggesting that he wants everything to be nice and smooth, but that some people reflect that or understand that everything that need to be faced in life. And so I highly recommend that you think about this and whether this is a flaw in Hans's perception, that he has this very comfortable idea of what reality is. And even in the face of things, war, death, severe illness, that he trenchantly maintains his comfort to its perspective. More about that later when I talk about the spiritual, but also the physical elements of both death and illness. Let's give an example of Hans and his attempted acclimating to his new environment. So just up from Germany and his comfortable little life in the city, he is immediately introduced to things that are very much strange to his prior existence. And what do I mean here? Well, they see he and his cousin a bobsled going down the mountain. An odd thing to see, but not so odd on the mountain. And yet, what is he from the Berg Hall? And when Hans hears this, the bodies, oh, I see. You don't say, Hans Kostel cried. And suddenly he burst into laughter, a violent, overpowering laughter, shook his chest and twisted his face, stiffened by cold wind, a cool wind into a slightly painful grimace. Oh, bobsleds. And you can sit there and tell me so calm and cool, you become quite the cynic in the past 5 months. Something that we will get constant reminders of in this text are what we often call by one word, but has two. You've heard of mementos, right? Many people call souvenirs mementos. You should know that a memento, however, is a shortened form of the true expression, which is the memento mori. Did any of you know what a memento mori is? Yes? A reminder of death. And so in this text, there are constant reminders of the presence of death. I challenge you. I suggest to you that you in your own bourgeois existence almost never encounter death. Almost never encounter even profound illness. Perhaps if you are, an intern at a hospital, you're starting to see some things like this. But I imagine that in your everyday life, almost none of you, and I'm not saying this is bad, but almost none of you see somebody who is morbidly ill. Almost none of you see somebody who is dead unless at awake. And why? Well, because this is kept from people in a bourgeois society. And we have undertakers who are responsible for, and emergency service personnel who are responsible for not only dealing with bodies, but also keeping them covered and keeping them away from the eyes of people going through their days. Why? And this is for the same reason that horses need to be taught during war to trample over dead bodies, which scare them at first. Death and illness naturally make people very uncomfortable, extremely uncomfortable. And so they're often kept from our eyes. In fact, something that professors of political science might say to you are like, if there were, say, an atrocity going on right now, they would say, look at the images, look at the videos, see it for yourself, which you could very much do if you wanted to, not very hard. And so, very comfortable, and yet is surrounded by that which is ultimately uncomfortable. The presence of illness which leads to death, that which reminds one of one's mortality. This is something that we very much dislike, interested in coming up with symbolic interpretations of the fall of Adam and Eve. You might say that the putting of a fig leaf over the genitalia of these characters was because they wished not to have reminders of their own progenitive nature. What was? Because the fact that one reproduces reminds one of what other fact of life is tied to birth. That one is doomed to die. Right, of course. And so we do everything possible to avoid thinking about death in our normal lives, which is probably pretty mentally healthy, right? You probably don't want to go around every day unless you're truly enlightened, knowing that you are going to die. In any case, I leave that. I express this to you to let you know that Hans is going through this transition right now from his sort of everyday existence, very similar to your own. He's just finished his examinations and is going to go become an engineer and be a successful sort of middle upper class man. Great for him. And now he's in this place where he hears this Austrian horseman who had this terrible rasping cough. It's described as slimy. He's never heard anything like it. How could you not think of that when you hear that? And even his new room, 3, 4, what's 3 plus 4? 7. Remember those 7s? How many days does he come up here for originally? 21. That's 7 days, or that's 7 times 3, or 21 divided by 3 is 7, because there are 3 weeks, each with 7 days that he is a member of. So really keeping the 7 imagery in mind. Note that his room 2 was just occupied by an American woman. And note also the ghastly conversation that Director Behrens apparently had with Joachim. Do you remember what their conversation consisted of? So it's a week before, about 7 days, before Hans shows up. And what is Joachim concerned about? Whether there will be somewhere for Hans to sleep. And what does Director Behrens say? Oh, this American woman has just had a terrible hemorrhage. I doubt that she will last for the week. So I am sure that your cousin will have somewhere to sleep. This is sort of a ghastly, grotesque, macabre, morbid way of speaking to everyday, right? That just cavalierly asserting that somebody is going to die, and then dignity, right? You want to think that you would be worth more to such an individual than just a bed. That's, I mean, are we more than just that American woman? I wonder. But in any case, this is further evidence that the place Hans is now going to exist, at least for the next 3 weeks, the first 4 chapters, is very different from the place that he has existed. And I very much encourage you to take Settembrini's description of the tuberculous sanatorium as an underworld seriously, as if it is like a cul-de-sac, a place where nothing happens, where there is no development and growth. And think about that. Even the romantic relationships, what is it that they lead to here? What is it, the relationship between Madame Shosha, who is herself married and described literally as worm-eaten inside? What is it that her relationship with Hans Castorp will produce and will generate? Where is it going? Is it going anywhere? And perhaps you will have noted that he has already connected in his mind this character Shivislav Hippa, a young man who seemed to have some interest in when he was a young, who himself had a foreign look with high cheekbones and slanted eyes, which reminds him of Frau Shosha. What is it? What connects his relationship with Hippa, a young man whom he shares a pencil with? And I just have to mention this very quickly to you. I don't take the bait on every chance one has in literature to see a psychoanalytic phallus, but I will say one thing about sharing a pencil, particularly before art class, is that in the same way that an ithophallus, an erect phallus, is a tool of propagation and production, so is a pencil also a tool of production and creation, particularly in the visual arts, but also in writing. So to share a pencil between one artist and another is like an abstract a phallus. And just to make this point stronger, what is the connection between Hans Castorp's feeling for Shivislav Hippa and then later for Madame Shosha? I'll give you one piece of information you don't yet have, or I guess I mentioned it earlier. They will copulate later. And so the feelings he has for Hippa, who then in his own dream transforms into Madame Shosha, there seems to be a uniformity, or at least a strong analogy and connection between his feelings for one and his feelings for the other. And it will be, in fact, the case that during a game in Valpurgis, a pencil from Madame Shosha, she'll say, make sure to give it back. He will give it back. He will have to go to her room to get it. And he will take a little memento mori from her room, a little souvenir, which is a picture of her insides. Again, a bit of a morbid thing to take. Yeah, what were they doing in that room? A little bit of Blazes Boylan and Molly Bloom happening there, Mrs. Marianne Bloom. Tell you. In any case, I've gotten ahead of myself. The dream that Hans Castorp has, but his first night, the first day takes place during chapter 3. The first night during chapter 1, chapter 2 tells us the background about him. This dream is potentially a prophetic. And something I wish for you to think about is, does the nature of dreaming in this text suggest that time is an illusion? That we break time down into past, present, and future arbitrarily in order to keep the time, as it were. But in so attempting to keep it, we still lose track of time. And so what does it mean for a dream to suggest an action in the present that happens in the future? That then does happen in the future? How could the dream know? And this is a sort of underlying question. I'll say that one of the psychoanalysts that Thomas Mann knew well was Carl Jung. And he does seem to come down pretty hard on Sigmund Freud. When he has Dr. Krukowski reduce everything to love and lust, that's very much a Freudian psychoanalytic perspective. But in considering time as potentially something beyond our grasp, he seems to be suggesting, here's some Latin for you, something similar to the Jungian idea of unus mundus. That means the one world, which suggests that though we perceive things in time, the time itself goes beyond our perception, and that which is past, present, and future may all exist at once, contrary to how we see things. Some theologians suggest that this is how God would see it, for example, in a triptych, sort of way, that the past, the present, and the future are all spatially represented at the same time, and so they all exist at the same time. Though I will say that there is a certain fatalism and determinism that is obviously attached to such a perspective. If all time exists all at once, then do you have any agency in determining what happens in time? Big question. In any case, on his dream. But as soon as he was asleep, he began to dream, kept on dreaming, almost nonstop until morning. Most of the time he saw Joachim seem strangely contorted position, riding down a steep slope on a bobsled. He was as phosphorescently pale as Dr. Krukowski, and up front saw the Austrian horseman steering, although the face was very vague. It was a very good description from the dream, right? How many times do you see a character in a dream, but you don't remember their face? Like that of someone you've only heard cough. It doesn't really matter to us. To us up here, the contorted Joachim said, imagine someone you love in a contorted position. How much that would hurt you. And now it was he, not the horseman, who was coughing in that ghastly, slimy way. And this made Hans Castorp weep bitterly. His dream suggesting what? Dream, if he happens to be a prophet, suggests that his cousin will someday die and take the bobsled down. Right, exactly. Interesting. That has not yet happened in the narrative. Chapter 2, a history of tragedy. Once he's through Hans' how his story concerns his extraordinary fate rather than extraordinary abilities. Something always to keep in mind here, that this story features an ordinary protagonist who has an extraordinary life. But he is not himself extraordinary in terms of his abilities, like Stephen Dedalus, like Leopold Bloom, like Mrs. Marion would, as it were. This chapter concerns the early loss of his mother, directly followed by his father, directly followed by his stately grandfather before the 7th year of his life, and then he's raised by the teenagers. Originally, this was supposed to be the first chapter of the book, but it was moved to the second. This is probably rhetorically intelligent. You generally, an author must hook you and make its character interesting to you. Something that I've said to you before, but something I wish you keep in mind is that often when comic book authors create a comic book character, or sitcom writers create characters, they create them without backstory. And it's only after audiences are interested in the stories and they continue on that then there's an impetus to create backstories for these characters. This is why often the first, second seasons of sitcoms are wildly different and inconsistent with those afterwards. I'll mention one. In Boy Meets World, there is a sister who's part of the main family in the first season, and then she disappears forever. Also, there's a character who's like the nerd named Minkus in the very first episode, and he doesn't show up again until the end of high school. And they joke about the fact that where have you been for like 5 years? And it's like, oh, I was on the other end of school. But you can find countless examples of these sorts of inconsistencies because that is the process by which fictional characters are generated, often. In any case, originally this was supposed to be the first chapter of the book, but I think very rhetorically intelligently, Mann switched it to the second. Hans shows here his thoughts on death. They are very similar to his thoughts later on illness, which he shares with Severine. Will very much demur with him, will disagree with him. Analyze and put into words his being Hans Castorp's feelings might have been expressed as follows. There was something religious, gripping, sadly beautiful, which was to say spiritual about death. But at the same time, something that was the direct opposite, something very material, physical, which one could not really describe as gripping or religious, or even as sad. Is that spiritual or material? Is it both? Is it more one than the other? Depending on how one dies, are there more spiritual or romantic deaths? Surely you believe that that is the case, having read a mock chivalric romance and seen that. But I mention this because Fyodor Dostoevsky, in his greatest work, The Brothers Karamazov, has a character named Alyosha, who is very much a religious young man who very much loves an older man who is basically the priest of an Eastern Orthodox church that he is a member of. This man dies. And when Alyosha goes to see his body, full of veneration, expecting to feel sort of spiritual thoughts, and you should think of Eastern Orthodox iconography, the very rich artistic tradition there. And so he walks into this room expecting to see this person who's ostensibly ascended to heaven, which he believes in as a Christian. And what is he afflicted by? Smell. It smells so awful in the room. He has to leave and causes some spiritual crisis. So there, in that text at least, and I would say also in this one, there is a tremendously physical aspect of death. And those of us who have had to experience death and have had to work with people who work with death know that there are economic and physical elements which are very important, like when one presents a body after it has died. Very important that the various gases and things in one's stomach have moved through. These are sort of gross things to think about, but these are things that people who deal with physical aspects of death have to deal with. And often what people during the course of their lives have to selectively during certain times deal with too, as people die themselves. There may well be spiritual aspects to death, but there are certainly physical aspects to death as well. Chapter 3, getting to know the Berghoff. I'm not going to say too much about this because I don't have much time to say it, but I will say that Hans Castorp died at the Joachim's table. Note that there are 7 tables. He will sit at all 7 tables over his 7 years thereafter, his first 7 times 3 weeks in the first 4 chapters here. Josha, who it was reminded to me, though it's missing a D, by one of our French speakers here, our francophones, that means hot cat, though it is also very much a reference to the World War I machine gun called the Shosha, which was a beloved by American soldiers, but was known to be more expensive to fix than it was to get a new one. So it's something that could be cast aside. It didn't really work too well. Something we hear about Madame Shosha is that she is worming on the inside, and she is very much a love interest, but is already married, is not exactly a marital interest of Hans Castorp. So you might think of connections between Sleep by his dark beer. We know that he loves his Maria Mancini cigarettes. Creature comforts is a comfortable sort of person. He even has a certain way that he likes to hold his chin based on his grandfather used to after drinking his beer. He's so lazy. My word for him. but he does finally meet Herr Settembrini. Remember that his name's Herr Ludovico Settembrini, his soon to be failing guide and mentor, sort of a figure of, say, your instructor in this class. I say himself as malicious. Very interesting that he describes himself as malicious rather than enlightening. And we also see another odd mark of death or memento mori, where this Herr Albin, this character, has a knife, is terrifying the women around him. He claims that if he's not allowed to smoke his cigarettes, though he has terrible afflictions in his lungs, unbelievable, the early 20th century, and also Europe is still very much more smoke friendly than the United States is. In fact, in Paris this summer, people lighting up cigarettes right next to me in the cafe, and as an American, I was like, oh. But then that shows that I'm this American, if I really have that perspective. In any case, Herr Albin goes to grab his gun and claims he will commit suicide. So bobsleds, terrible whooping coughs, dreams about death, a guy with a gun threatening to commit suicide. This is not everybody's everyday existence off the mountain. It's a very different place to be. And so Hans Castorp is going to have to do quite a bit of settling in. And well, Settembrini will warn him about the effects of the mountain, but I will not be able to tell you about what he has to say until next time because we've run out of